How wonderful. So let me start with the spirit of bilingualism, which, as you know, is such an important part of Canada. Ich bin so zufrieden zu sein, du mit allem. Je suis vraiment fière d'être ici parmi vous cet après-midi. My justice journey, in fact, my life's journey, started with the injustices revealed at Nuremberg. Who I am, what I believe in, and what I hope for, all started with the Holocaust. 200,000 European Jews survived the Holocaust. 2 of them were my parents. My father got a scholarship to the Jagiellonian University in Krakow to study law in 1930. Because there was a quota on the number of Jews admitted to the law school, he was one of only 4 Jews admitted in a class of over 100. Rather than sit in the seats reserved for Jewish students, he stood through most of his first year at university. After he finished his 8 years of legal training, he married my mother on September the 3rd, 1939. He never got to practice law in Poland. He and my mother spent 4 years in concentration camps. Their 2.5-year-old son and my father's parents and 3 younger brothers died at Treblinka. After the war, my parents went to Germany, where the Americans hired my father, who had taught himself English, as a defense counsel for displaced persons in the Allied zone in southwest Germany. In an act that seems to me almost incomprehensible in its breathtaking optimism, my parents and thousands of other survivors transcended the inhumanity they had experienced and decided to have more children. I was born in 1946 and my sister in 1948. I think it was a way to fix their hearts and to prove to themselves and the world that their spirits were not broken. My father applied to emigrate to Canada, but was refused because his European legal education was not then considered as a useful skill. He was eventually permitted entry as a tailor's cutter and a shepherd. When we arrived in Canada in 1950, he applied to the Law Society to become a lawyer. He was told he couldn't be admitted to the bar because he wasn't a Canadian citizen. That would have taken 5 years, so he became an insurance agent instead to support his family. He did well, and I never heard him complain about not being able to practice his profession. The moment I heard the story about his being denied the right to be a lawyer was the moment I decided to become one. I was 4. I had no idea what it meant to be a lawyer, but it didn't matter. I was going to be whatever it was my father wanted to be and couldn't. Even as a young child, it felt so unfair, even if he never spent a moment of lament or complaint over it. The lack of lament or complaint in my home growing up was, as I look back on it, extraordinary. No bitterness, no anger, no fear, only hope. And so my parents tirelessly devoted their new lives not to despair over what they had lost, but to teaching their 2 daughters that they had a duty to work hard and make a contribution to the country that took them in as Jewish refugees and offered its opportunities to them. I understood none of this until I became a parent myself. In fact, I simply did not appreciate growing up the full horror of what had happened to my parents during the Second World War. All I knew was how incredibly lucky I was to have such wonderful, loving, and positive people as parents. They told me whenever I asked, and never with tears, what it had been like in concentration camp, what it felt like when they learned that their 2.5-year-old son had been killed, how they ended up in Canada, and what it meant to lose everything and almost everyone and start all over again. But the truth is, I have never been able to understand what happened to my parents, or how they managed to survive, or how, having survived, they were able to create such resolutely normal lives for themselves and their 2 children, let alone encourage us to embrace optimism and justice so unreservedly. But they did, and so did thousands of other survivors who rebuked the indignity and barbaric humiliation they'd suffered as Jews by living and creating lives of dignity and pride in who they were. But while my parents never forgot how lucky they were to be able to restart their lives in Canada, neither did they forget why they came. As we know from Rosalie Abella's brilliant book, None is Too Many, the Jews of Europe begged the world to be released from their horrible victimization, begged for entry to be released from their dehumanization, and begged for refuge to be released from destruction. We know the world's answer. It was a powerful echo of neglect that reverberated throughout history. The Holocaust is the history of this neglect. 6 million innocent people who happen to be Jewish no longer laugh, weep, love, or create. The world lost, and lost cruelly, not only the minds and hearts of millions who died in utter despair at the inconceivable indifference that permitted their loss, it lost the right ever to expect a single Jew to stand silently in the face of an injustice. How can we be expected ever to forget the sheer horror of being denied the very right to exist? It was arbitrary, it was immoral, and it was uncivilized. It was also unforgivable. The world was supposed to have learned 3 indelible lessons from the concentration camps of Europe. 1, indifference is injustice's incubator. 2, it's not just what you stand for, it's what you stand up for. And 3, we must never forget how the world looks to those who are vulnerable. Those were the lessons the Nuremberg trials exposed. I was born in Germany at the beginning of the Nuremberg trials, surrounded by the survivors for whom it was created, nurtured by parents who had somehow escaped the final Nazi verdict, and watched a father try to help create a system of justice for people in Germany who didn't know such a thing could exist in Germany for Jews. I never asked my parents if they took any comfort from the Nuremberg trials, which were going on for 4 of the 5 years we were in Germany. I have no idea if they got any consolation from the conviction of dozens of the worst offenders. But of this I am very sure. They would have preferred by far that the sense of outrage that inspired the Allies to establish the military tribunal at Nuremberg had been aroused many years earlier, before the events that led to Nuremberg ever took place. They would have preferred, I'm sure, that world reaction to the 1933 Reichstag fire decree suspending whole portions of the Weimar Constitution, to the 1935 Nuremberg laws prohibiting social contact with Jews, or to the brutal rampage of Kristallnacht in 1938. They would have preferred, I'm sure, that world reaction to any of these events, let alone all of them, would have been, at the very least, public censure. But there was no such world reaction. By the time World War II officially started on September the 3rd, 1939, the day my parents got married, it was too late. The American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, said in his opening address at the Nuremberg trials, "The wrongs we seek to condemn have been so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." But as we know, what was never supposed to happen again has, again and again. We clearly still have not learned the most important lesson we were supposed to learn from the Holocaust, to try to prevent the abuses in the first place. The gap between the values the international community articulates and the values it enforces is so wide that almost any country that wants to can push its abuses through it. No national abuser seems to worry whether there'll be a Nuremberg trial later, because usually there isn't. And in any event, by the time there is, all the damage that was sought to be done has already been done. Nations debate, people die. Nations dissemble, people die. Nations defy, people die. All too often, we appear reluctant as a global community to call to meaningful account the intolerant countries who abuse their citizens and instead hide behind silencing concepts like cultural relativism, domestic sovereignty, or root causes. These are concepts that excuse intolerance. Silence in the face of intolerance means that intolerance wins. Why hasn't the Holocaust created a desperate, unquenchable thirst for enforceable international norms that make intolerance intolerable anytime and anywhere it occurs? We are the generation whose commitment to justice was the phoenix that emerged from the ashes of Auschwitz. How many more outrages will we witness before we lose the final victim, our humanity? And so, in conclusion, to thinking forward, the theme of this year's GA. My father died a month before I graduated from law school in 1970 and never lived to see his inspiration take flight in his daughter or in his two grandsons, both of whom became lawyers. But my mother did and carried me proudly into the future on the shoulders of her unwavering confidence for 40 more years. A few years ago, she gave me some of my father's papers from Germany that I had never seen. One of the most powerful documents I found was written by my father when he was head of the displaced persons camp in Stuttgart, where we lived. It was his introduction to Eleanor Roosevelt when she came to visit our DP camp in 1948. He said, "We welcome you, Mrs. Roosevelt, as the representative of a great nation whose victorious army liberated the remnants of European Jewry from death and so highly contributed to their moral and physical rehabilitation. We shall never forget that aid rendered by both the American people and Army. We are not in a position of showing you many assets. The best we are able to produce are these few children. They alone are our fortune and our sole hope for the future." As one of those children, I am here to tell you that the gift of American justice at its best is the gift that just keeps right on giving, a gift that propelled me all the way from a DP camp in Germany to being appointed the first Jewish woman on the Supreme Court of Canada by Irwin Cotler as Justice Minister. My life started in a country where there had been no democracy, no rights, no justice. It created an unquenchable thirst in me for all three. No one with this history does not feel lucky to be alive and free. No one with this history takes anything or anyone for granted. And no one with this history does not feel that we have a particular duty to wear our Jewish identity with pride and to promise our children that we will do everything humanly possible to make the world safer for them than it was for their grandparents. A world where all children, regardless of race, religion, or gender, can wear their identities with dignity, pride, and in peace. Thank you.